Good morning, Neston. A pleasure to be back here to tell you about the Star of Bethlehem. It's looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew and asking the question, are there any astronomical candidates that might fit the account of what happened during the Nativity? Not only the Gospel, but another account that we're trying to match up to is this one. Let's just have the first verse. Sing along if you like. We're going to be spending our time looking at mainly the Gospel of St. Matthew with a little diversion into Christmas carols. So we're looking at the account that talks about the Magi and the appearance of a star in the east. And we're asking, are there any astronomical candidates that could have explained the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem? How well do they fit the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew? And do the dates fit? In other words, if we look at what happened when, can we find any astronomical events that fit the timeline approximately of the Nativity? And then I'll finish by showing a little planetarium software called Starry Night that shows us where things were in the sky 2,000 years ago. And then I'll summarize. So first, let's just remind ourselves, because I had to, because I'm not a scholar of the Bible, let's remind ourselves what are the principal accounts in the Gospel of St. Matthew. And I'm going to highlight in red the various aspects that we're trying to explain. So the account says that the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by, quote, a star in the east. So that's the first thing we have to try and account for, the appearance of a star in the east. Bear in mind that in the account, it does not talk about them following the star. They were prompted by a star in the east, and they went west. They went in the opposite direction. They got to Jerusalem, and they asked King Herod, what's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews? So why would a star in the east be interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews? Herod apparently was unaware of what they were talking about, and so the Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky, and then stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 bits in red, a star appears in the east, it can be interpreted as a birth of the King of the Jews. Herod was not aware of what they were talking about, the star reappears and the star stops. If we can find some candidate that matches up to those 5 aspects of the account, then maybe we found a possible Star of Bethlehem. Firstly, let's just return to the Christmas carol, and again, remind ourselves about the lyrics in the first verse of the Christmas carol, written there, but let's just remind ourselves of the full verse. That's enough of that. Okay, we 3 kings of Orient are. Where does the 3 come from? There's nothing in the Bible that talks about 3 wise men or 3 magi or 3 anything. There's no mention of 3 people visiting Jesus. There is mention of 3 gifts being brought, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it's often assumed that if there were 3 gifts, there were 3 people. But we don't actually know. There could have been 20 magi. 17 of whom were saying, we didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts, and the other 3 bought the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So the Christmas carol, we 3 kings, we really shouldn't talk about 3 because there's no indication there were 3 of them. So we ought to remove that from the Christmas carol. And where do you get kings from? There's no mention of kings in the Bible. St. Matthew talks about the Magi, plural of magus, wise man. So we do believe there were wise men, but they weren't necessarily kings. That's just something that appeared in the carol but is not in the Bible. So we ought not to have kings in there either. Where did these magi come from? Well, the Bible doesn't say. It doesn't say whether they came from Persia. Some people believe they might have been Persian priests. Might have been Persia, Might have been India, might have been Outer Mongolia, might have been somewhere else, but there's no indication of geographically where they actually came from. So if you regard Orient as being the Orient as opposed to somewhere east of where I'm standing, which is a rather liberal interpretation, we really ought not to have that in the carol either. And remember, they saw a star in the east and went in the opposite direction. So you could argue they didn't really follow yonder star. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And as a physicist, being a scientist, I like accuracy, I like precision. And so if we can't justify the three, or the kings, or the Orient, or following a star, we ought not to have it in the Christmas carol. I suggest rewording the carol to something more like, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, who saw a star. And now you can see why physicists do not write Christmas carols, because the first one is wrong, but meters a lot better than the second one. And just as an aside, remember we shouldn't be talking about the three wise men. We should be talking about the n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. It's definitely bigger than 1 because magi is plural for magus, and the gender, I am told, in the original Bible account is male. So it is men, it is plural, but we don't know where n lies other than greater than 1 and presumably less than infinity. Let's return to the idea of what the star might have been. Remember, one thing to bear in mind is star should not be taken literally in the astrophysical sense that we understand star now. So at the moment we know that a star is a large ball of gas in which thermonuclear fusion is happening in the core, providing all the energy, all the heat and the light that's keeping all the planets of the solar system relatively warm. But we must remember that star for many century, if not millennium, has been used in a different context to mean simply something seen in the night sky, other than presumably the moon, which is identifiable easy enough. And some of these labels of stars for things other than what we would now call stars, they've survived. So for instance, fixed stars in fixed constellations were considered fixed, not in the sense they don't move. As the Earth rotates, the constellations appear to move in the sky, but they all move in the same pattern. The patterns are fixed. The stars are fixed relative to each other. But some points of light would wander through the constellations, and these wandering stars are what we would now call planets, and we understand what they are. But originally they were just points of light, very similar to stars, but they would move relative to the constellations. And some stars were not pinprick points of light. They seemed to have tails. They're hairy stars or broom stars. We would now call them comets. Comets basically are like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable. Unpredictable in the sense that we can't tell exactly how long a tail of a comet is going to be. So whenever we talk about a comet appearing in the solar system, we can talk with some accuracy as to where it is going, its orbit, but we can't talk with any accuracy as to how long a tail it's going to be, because that depends on how the ices of the comet evaporate as it approaches the sun, and that determines how long and how bright the tail is. So hairy stars, and of course shooting stars is something we currently still say, especially in lay conversation. We would perhaps more correctly call them meteors or meteor showers, but shooting stars is a very common phrase for talking about meteors. So you can see star could in principle be a planet or a comet or a meteor or a star in the sense that we understand it. Basically, just think of star as something in the night sky other than the moon. Do we have any clues by looking at depictions, for instance, of the Adoration of the Magi, which has been painted many, many times? Not surprisingly, we don't learn much because most of these paintings, of course, were many, many centuries after the Nativity. But it's quite common to find, in this case 1624, it's quite common to find not only do we have three kings, always three, no matter what I said earlier, it's always three of them. There's always three of them, and usually there's the Star of Bethlehem in the background, sometimes shining its radiance down onto the baby Jesus. But not surprisingly, we don't learn much from the nature of the Star of Bethlehem looking at these various paintings. Presumably that's the Star of Bethlehem up at the top there. This is Botticelli, 1475. Joseph at the back looking very bored, not taking part in any of the celebrations. Perhaps that's appropriate, as allegedly he didn't take part in the conception either. So fair enough, it's widely believed that's Botticelli himself photobombing his own painting there on the right-hand side. 1423, again, we don't learn anything. Presumably that's the Star of Bethlehem in the background. One of the few artists that actually depicts the Star of Bethlehem not as a star in the sense we understand, but as a comet, Giotto, 1305, which is why the spacecraft that visited Halley's Comet was called Giotto in honor, if you like, of this particular painting. So what appears to be quite definitely an object with a tail, so it's almost certain that this was supposed to indicate a comet, but one of the few painters that actually showed the star as a comet. I couldn't find the date of this one, but Rubens, apparently one of the few that shows the adoration of the Magi without the Star of Bethlehem in the background, rather oddly. So I couldn't see a star anywhere in the background there. There is, interestingly enough, a two-headed camel, but no Star of Bethlehem at the back there. So it's an interesting time, had boy all, obviously. Let's think about the astrological significance. We have to remember that astrology was very important even until just a few centuries ago. Astrology was very important. Every planet, every bright star, every constellation, especially those constellations in the zodiac, remember those are the ones in which the planets go backwards and forwards with the zodiac constellations in the background there. Every planet, every star, every zodiac constellation had some sort of astrological significance. So, for instance, the planet that might be called Venus or Aphrodite, depending on whether you're picking names from Roman or Greek mythology. So Venus would be associated with beauty, Aphrodite and beauty, Venus and beauty, and also fertility and also birth. Jupiter, or Zeus if you prefer, was the chief god, if that's the right word to use, the most important of the various gods that existed. So Jupiter was considered the king of planets, was considered royalty in the sense that he was the chief god. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and perhaps you can tell from its name starting with the three letters REG, this was considered the king of stars. It's one of the brightest, not the brightest star in the sky, but one of the brightest stars in the sky, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo itself, because its outline, many people thought, looks a little bit like a lion, and a lion occurs on the flag of the people of Judea, then the constellation of Leo associated with the lion was also associated with the land of Judea and the people of Judea. Why would you associate either planets or constellations or stars with particular meaning? Well, astrologers would always look to the sky because that's where they figured they would find out what God had in store for them. Are we going to have a good harvest? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have an earthquake? If you want to know what God has in store for mankind, you look to the stars where everything is written, and if you interpret it correctly, you can tell what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, whatever. In other words, you can think of the sky basically as being God's Facebook page. This is where he posts things, and that's where he tells you what he has in mind. And therefore, it's always worth keeping an eye on the sky, because that's how you tell the future. And if you're an astrologer, especially if you're an astrologer paid by, for instance, King Herod, you would look to the sky in order to advise King Herod as what's going to happen in the near future. Let's have a think at what possible candidates exist in terms of all the possibilities, what could, in principle, have been the Star of Bethlehem. We're going to look at a few different, quote, stars, unquote, and we're going to ask ourselves, does it match the 5 criteria that I pointed out in red from the original Gospel of St. Matthew? Could it have been interpreted as a star in the east? Would it have been a significant appearance of a star? Is it possible, is it reasonable that Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about when the Magi said, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" Could the star reappear in the sky, and could it stop in the sky? So we're going to have a look at a few candidates and see what fits. Firstly, shooting stars or meteors. Could you have a meteor shower in which you say, let's imagine that that could be written down or interpreted as a star in the east? Well, meteors appear all over the sky. regardless of whether they're part of a shower or not, they will still appear pretty much anywhere in the sky. So there's no reason why you would ever talk about a meteor appearing as being a star in the east. Could it have been significant? Well, meteor showers happen a few times during the year, pretty much every year. They keep coming back year after year after year because the Earth is passing through debris in the solar system. So there's no reason why you would consider a particular meteor shower as significant because it happens all the time. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of the significance? Well, if it's insignificant, yes, of course, Herod wouldn't know what they were talking about. Could it reappear in the sky? Well, meteor showers come and go. You might have a meteor shower for a few nights during one part of the year, and then they would die down a bit, and then another meteor shower might reappear some months later. So yes, it could reappear in the sky. But what's this idea of a star stopping in the sky? Meteors, generally speaking, flashes of light across the sky. Why would you ever talk about a meteor stopping in the sky? So that doesn't make sense. So that doesn't seem to fit. Moving on. What about a comet? Yes, I know it looks more like a meatball there in this particular icon. I couldn't find a better icon than that. So this particular comet, could a comet appear in the east? Yes, comets can appear pretty much anywhere in the sky, so it could appear in the east. Would it have been significant? If it was a bright enough comet with a long enough tail, remember it's very difficult to tell whether they had long, bright tails or not, but if it was a bright comet, it could have been significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said comet? Well, if it's a comet and it's big and it's bright and it's new, surely Herod must be aware of what they were talking about. So that doesn't seem to fit. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun, and every once in a while a comet might apparently disappear from our night sky as it goes behind the sun, and then a little while later it would appear on the other side of the sun, perhaps changing from a morning object to an evening object or vice versa. So yes, a comet can reappear in the sky. Could a comet stop in the sky? Well, it's not obvious how that would happen. Some people have said, oh yeah, it is possible, because as the comet goes round the sun, perhaps for a little while the comet comes towards the Earth and appears not to move in the sky. Maybe, so maybe that X ought to be a question mark rather than an X. What other candidates do we have? What about a nova, a new star appearing in the sky? Not a new star as such, but a star that brightens and becomes visible. So in other words, a star was not visible at a particular point in the sky, but then becomes visible for perhaps a few weeks, perhaps even a few months. We now know the astrophysical cause of nova, but that's irrelevant. We know nova occur, so it might have occurred at around the time of the Nativity. Could a nova appear in the east? Yes, again, they can occur all over the sky. Could it have been significant? Well, if it was a bright enough star, a really faint star, people aren't going to really notice, but a very bright star appearing where no star was there before, that would have been considered significant. But again, if it was significant, why was Herod denying all knowledge of said object in the sky? So that's not obvious how that fits in. Could a star reappear in the sky? Well, nova are temporary brightening of stars, which then fade away again. It is possible for that same star in the same position to brighten again later, but normally that happens decades or hundreds of years later, not a few months later in order to fit the story of the Nativity. So reappearing in the sky doesn't seem to fit. And what about the star stopping in the sky? Well, if the star is one of the fixed stars, fixed in position relative to the rest of the constellations, why would you talk about the star stopping in the sky if it wasn't moving in the first place? So that doesn't seem to fit. What about a supernova? Well, a different piece of astrophysics, but essentially a very bright new star. If a star decides to come to the end of its life and explode, depending on how far it is away from the Earth, it might produce a very bright light in the sky. Some very massive stars we know are hundreds of light years away. When they eventually die in a supernova, they could become so bright they could be visible not only very brightly at night, they could actually be visible during the day. So a supernova could be an absolutely spectacular event. Could a supernova occur in the east? Quite definitely, yes. Would it be significant? Well, if it was close enough and bright enough, it would have definitely been significant. Again, if it was significant, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, a supernova is associated with the death of a star that's blown itself to pieces. Generally speaking, once a star has done that, doesn't do it a second time. So a reappearance of the said supernova, unlikely, or perhaps impossible. And again, star stopping in the sky. If it's fixed relative to the other stars, why would you talk about the star stopping in the sky? So that doesn't seem to fit either. The fifth point, the fifth candidate, if you like, for the Star of Bethlehem is the one that a lot of people think is the most likely. So, people disagree, let me make that clear. Some people think it quite definitely was a comet. Other people say, no, it wasn't a comet. It is more likely to be a conjunction of planets, a bringing together of planets. That symbol there is the astrological symbol for planets coming together in the sky. Planets go around the sun at different speeds. Every once in a while, two planets can appear to be in the same part of the sky, perhaps quite close together. That can happen in the east, depending on how you interpret, astrologically speaking, depending on how you interpret which planets in which constellation, it might be significant. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, perhaps Herod didn't have very good eyesight, but he would have had a whole load of astrologers advising him as to what's going on in the sky. Perhaps they came to a different astrological conclusion, having seen the same conjunction. So that is a possibility. Can a conjunction reappear in the sky? Yes, planets are going around the sun all the time, and they can not only come into conjunction, they can then continue moving and perhaps come back into conjunction a little time later. So yes, that can reappear. And can a star stop in the sky? Well, planets can, via a mechanism that I'll show you in just a moment. Let's just establish the basic facts about how planets move. Two hypothetical planets moving around the sun. The most important thing about orbital mechanics, as far as we're concerned, is that the ones that are closer to the sun move faster. If you've got a stronger gravitational pull to the sun, you have to move faster to stay in orbit. So the green planet is moving faster than the red planet. Not only has it got a smaller circuit to complete, it's also moving faster. So these planets, you notice, will sometimes be in different parts of the sky and sometimes will appear to be, as it were, lined up, depending on where you are viewing from. So that's something to bear in mind. Planets, let me just run that again so we're clear. Planets will move at different speeds, so their location in the zodiac, in the constellations, in the plane of the Earth's orbit, they will appear to move to different places and occasionally seem to line up. Now, it's not shown in this diagram, but the orbits are actually ever so slightly different in angle. They're not all strictly in the same plane. So when two planets come together in the sky, they often miss each other in much the same way that the moon goes round the Earth once a month, but it doesn't produce an eclipse every time it goes between us and the sun. It doesn't produce a lunar eclipse every time it's on the opposite side, because the moon's orbit is tilted, so as the moon and the sun pass each other in the sky, one goes slightly north or south of the other. They don't actually go in front of each other. Same with planets. They usually miss each other by a fraction of a degree because of the tilt of the orbits. But because those inner planets are moving faster than the outer planets, there's a particular property we see when looking at the outer planets. Let's imagine the green planet is Earth. S is still the sun. The green planet is now Earth, and the red planet is one of the outer planets. It could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, in principle, any of those. The red planet is going around the sun. Let's imagine it's anti-clockwise. Let's imagine we're looking at this from above the Earth's north pole. So the planet is going around the sun this way. So in the sky, it appears to move from right to left, from west to east. And as it moves from west to east, it's moving essentially at constant speed. But every once in a while, the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane. Remember, the inner planets are moving faster. So every once in a while, the Earth will overtake it. And at this particular point here, the Earth is moving fast enough such that even though the planet is moving still anti-clockwise, for a little while it'll appear to move backwards in the sky simply because the Earth is moving faster. In much the same way that when you've got cars on the motorway, if you're bombing down the outside lane fast enough, a car that's moving at 60 miles an hour, if you're doing 80, that car will appear to be moving backwards relative to you. Same idea. So when you see what's happening in the sky, outer planets like Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn can spend most of their time moving from west to east, but every once in a while they will appear to stop in the sky, start moving backwards, stop again, and then continue their west to east movement in the sky. And that's nothing to do with the motion of the planet itself, it's simply because Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane. Run that again, whoops, goes from west to east, and then every once in a while it will stop, move backwards as the Earth overtakes it, and then stop again and continue moving forward. This so-called retrograde motion, making little S's in the sky, is something that has been observed for millennia, and now we understand exactly why it occurs because of our knowledge of how the solar system works. So now we've got a better idea of how planets move, let's just return to the timeline to see if there's anything else that could possibly fit the timeline of the Nativity. So when was Christ born? Part of the problem is we don't know when Christ was born. There are no tablets chiseled anywhere that says Christ was born in 6 BC or that King Herod died in 4 BC. We can only date things from other things. We can date one event by relating it to other events. It's almost impossible to relate it to a fixed calendar. So many people believe that Christ was born sometime between 4 and 8 BC. One thing to notice, by the way, is there's no 0. If you go backwards through the ADs, when you go to 1 year earlier than 1 AD, there is no such thing as 0 AD. It goes straight from 1 AD to 1 BC. That's something to bear in mind if you want to try and simulate for yourself using the app on your phone or your iPad or your computer how the sky looked in a particular year. So we're talking about the years with no 0 AD. Dating when Christ was born is usually fixed according to when King Herod died. But many biblical scholars, I'm not one of them because I know nothing about the Bible, I haven't read it in the original language. Of course, you have to worry about translations through multiple languages, but some people believe that the timing of the death of King Herod has been timed incorrectly. King Herod died not in a particular year, NBC, but King Herod died after the eclipse, which followed the flood, which followed this, which followed that. If you have a series of events, you can then say that means that King Herod must have died in this particular year. But many people believe that actually people have been dating it with the wrong eclipse, and actually it was an eclipse that occurred later which dictated when King Herod died. And King Herod actually died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. Which means there's a possibility that Christ was actually born somewhere around 1 or 2 or 3 BC. Quite why nobody believes in this particular gap, I don't know, but it's either one or the other is the general belief. What was around in the sky that could conceivably have been the Star of Bethlehem? Well, there were comets around. For instance, there was one probably very bright comet in about 12 BC. We know it was a fairly bright comet because we keep seeing it every 76 years. It's Halley's Comet. And every time Halley's Comet comes around, it has a relatively bright tail. And so we can think, not sure, but we think that it would have been a bright-tailed comet back then. So that, you could say, if it's bright and long tail, comets are often considered harbingers of interesting news, sometimes doom, but not always. But you look at this and you say, well, why would God have posted this on his Facebook page in 12 BC if he was trying to say something interesting is about to happen? Isn't that a bit early to be posting something interesting is going to happen regarding the birth of the King of the Jews? There were other comets in 5 BC and 4 BC, which some people believe, well, you know, there's definitely comets around, but neither of these comets were very bright. The first one is called Comet Holmes. That came round a few years back. I'm not sure if anybody saw it, but it was a comet whose coma, the outer part of the comet, expanded enormously, and it became a very large comet when it visited us the last decade or so. But it's very unlikely it would have been bright when it came in this particular apparition 2,000 years ago. The next comet in 4 BC, that's the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, wonderful mouthful of a name. That's the one that the Rosetta spacecraft visited and put a little lander on, a Philae lander. So we've been to that comet, we've dumped a little spacecraft on it, we know about that comet, but it's a relatively small comet. It didn't have a spectacular tail last time it came around. Almost certainly it didn't have a spectacular tail when it appeared in 4 BC. So bright enough but wrong timing, right timing but not bright enough, so they don't seem to fit the bill. What about nova? Well, a new star was seen in the sky in about the end of 5 BC by the Chinese. It was recorded there as bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. Obviously, we're talking a long time before telescopes. In 4 BC, another nova was seen by the Koreans, who also noted a very bright nova seen with the naked eye. Now, nova don't tend to come along very often, especially very bright ones. The idea of two coming along in very quick succession doesn't seem right. So almost certainly there's been a dating error there somewhere, and actually they were looking at the same nova, and somewhere the calendars have got a little bit confused, and the end of 5 BC and the beginning of 4 BC, they're looking at the same nova. But we've already said that even if a new star appeared in the sky, it doesn't seem to match up with the account of St. Matthew. Yes, a new star might have been very interesting, but why would you talk about it reappearing and stopping in the sky, etc.? So then we come to the possibilities which are very interesting, conjunctions of planets. And here I'm using the astrological symbols. The first symbol is conjunction, and then the next symbols are the planets themselves. A curly 4 means Jupiter, a curly H means Saturn, and Venus on the end there. So there were conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, just like there were for us a few years back, again around this time of year, December, there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And it seems to be about the right timing. And some people believe that this possibly was related to the Star of Bethlehem. But I think that one is much more interesting. It's a conjunction between Jupiter and Venus. Remember, Saturn doesn't get particularly bright in our skies. Jupiter can be almost as bright as Venus, magnitude -4 or so, but Saturn tends to be a few magnitudes fainter than that. But Jupiter and Venus can both be very bright in our skies. And this particular set of conjunctions is worth having a closer look at, in my opinion. It, of course, only works if Christ was born in this period rather than here. There's no point having the Star of Bethlehem appear a couple of years or 3 years after the birth of Christ. So it only works if King Herod died in 1 BC or so. But let's have a look at these conjunctions. I'm showing a chunk of the night sky, and I'm looking in the direction of Leo. Perhaps you can recognize the constellation of Leo there, the sort of backward sickle. There's the brightest star in Leo, Regulus. I am not going to show the horizon. Otherwise, if I run a video forward of what happens as a function of time, the horizon will be jumping around all over the place as the Earth spins. And I'm going to fix our gaze in the direction of Leo, because that's where all the action is. I am not going to label everything that's going on, otherwise the labels get far too confusing. The only thing I have labeled is the planet Jupiter. But perhaps if those of you who know the sky, we've got the constellation of Gemini, the constellation of Cancer, the constellation of Leo here, the most important part of the zodiac as far as we're concerned. You probably can't read it, but I've set the clock to August of 3 BC to see what was in the sky at that sort of time, just prior to this interesting set of conjunctions. So let's see what happens if we run the clock forward. There's Jupiter. Remember, the inner planets, such as Venus, are going around the sun faster, and so they will appear, everything is going from west to east, from right to left. So the planets are moving on this diagonal line, the so-called ecliptic, the plane of the Earth's orbit, the zodiac if you prefer. And they're all moving from right to left at the moment, but Venus here is moving faster. So Venus is catching up with Jupiter at this point, August of 3 BC. Let's run the clock a little bit forward and see what happens. Venus is very close to Jupiter. There's a conjunction. They don't overlap each other. They get quite close, much like Jupiter and Saturn got quite close a few years back. Close means separated by perhaps as little as the diameter of the full moon, perhaps even less than that. In other words, you could just about cover both points of light with one of your fingers or your thumb. That is relatively close together, and that would have been seen as astrologically significant. How might you interpret the significance of this particular conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo? Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea. So that particular conjunction in the constellation of Leo could have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews, simply by the astrological significance of the various elements that are taking place there. I haven't shown where the horizon is, I haven't shown where the sun is, but this particular conjunction of Venus and Jupiter would have occurred in the early morning before sunrise. It would have been a star in the east. So in 3 BC, we have a star in the east, which could have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. So we have a number of elements of Matthew's account in place. Astrologers looking at that would think, okay, what does that mean, birth of the King of the Jews? Well, I don't know. Let's keep an eye on the sky and see if God gives us any more hints as to what's going on. So they watch the sky for a few more months. Venus moves on, moving from right to left. What's happening to Jupiter? Jupiter moves past Regulus, a close conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars. And as time goes by, this is still moving forward, Jupiter stops in the sky. It's no longer moving from west to east. It's stopped, and it's now moving backwards, part of its retrograde motion. The king of planets is now moving backwards and moves past the king of stars a second time. So they think, interesting, the king of planets and the king of stars has just passed each other twice. Let's keep watching. Jupiter stops in the sky again and then continues its normal forward motion from west to east, and it goes past Regulus a third time. So the king of planets passes the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months or so. The astrologers might interpret that as meaning one king is going to pass the crown over to a new king, perhaps, or something. So they figured birth of the King of the Jews, and one king is handing over to another king. Perhaps we ought to talk to the king of Jerusalem and see if he knows about the new king that's going to be usurping his throne. But when should we go and talk to this king in Jerusalem? Well, let's keep watching the sky and see what happens. There's Venus back again, because Venus is going around the sun a lot faster than Jupiter. And now Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction again. Now we're talking about the middle of 2 BC. The summer of 2 BC, Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction again in the constellation of Leo. Not in the east this time, but remember the star in the east was the first prompt they got. Now we have Venus and Jupiter very, very close together in the sky. Not close enough that you might think, oh, that's interesting, they're only separated by a small amount. In this case, they would be so close you could not actually tell them apart. No human vision would be acute enough to tell them apart as 2 points of light. Day by day, they would have got closer and closer together, and at this point, they would have merged into one very bright object in the sky. We can see just how close they get. Remember, we've got no telescopes back here, but if we imagine if we had a telescope, if we could magnify this enough, how close were Jupiter and Venus in the sky? Let's zoom in so we can see. That's how close they would have been in the sky. The disk of Jupiter and the disk of Venus, they're at different distances, but the 2 disks would have appeared to have touched. This field of view is a tiny, tiny fraction of a degree, far too small for anybody to actually resolve as 2 points of light. And although this is showing what the surface of Venus looks like, in practice, the very bright clouds of Venus would have made this blindingly bright, as well as Jupiter looking very bright in the sky as well. So how often do these planets get this close? So close that not only do they pass each other, but they pass each other with one planet almost hiding the other. Well, I haven't been able to find an exact number, but I think that conjunctions that are this close don't happen more often than about a few times per millennium. So I think it's a given that astrologers who saw that would never have seen anything like it before in their lives. And Venus and Jupiter again in conjunction in the constellation of Leo, that would have cemented the whole idea. That would have told them, go see King Herod and ask him what's going on. So to summarize the events of the last few months, what we're saying is that in August 3 BC, there was a fairly close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, which could have been interpreted as Venus birth, Jupiter king, Leo Jews. So that could have been interpreted as the birth of the king of the Jews. For the next few months, if you keep watching the sky, Jupiter passes Regulus, the king of planets, and the king of stars do a little dance and pass each other 3 times. So maybe one king is handing over the crown to another king. And the starting pistol was, if you keep watching the sky, you then end up with an incredible conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, which are so close together in the constellation of Leo, they could not be separated as 2 points of light, but they would have merged together. Perhaps that was the starting pistol. They then go to Jerusalem, talk to Herod, and ultimately on to Bethlehem. When do they actually reach Bethlehem? Well, we've got no idea. Remember, we don't know where they came from. Was it right next door? Was it Persia, India, Outer Mongolia, somewhere else? We don't know their mode of travel. If you look at Christmas cards, it's always on camels. But no, just because the Christmas cards say they're on camels doesn't mean they were on camels. They could have been walking. So it could have taken them probably not years, but maybe many, many weeks, if not months, to get from their starting place to to Bethlehem. It's interesting to note that in December of that year, Jupiter stops in the sky one more time. And so it does fit the account. If you imagine they didn't get there for a few months, if they were watching Jupiter in the sky, they would have seen Jupiter stop in the sky again. On what date in December does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? The date is December the 25th. Yes, I know that's just a coincidence because the Christian calendar simply took over the pagan festivals, the festival basically celebrating the end of the longest night. But it's just interesting that Jupiter decides to stop in the sky on that particular day. So maybe it was that set of conjunctions that I've just described that inspired the account. Maybe it was seen as a set of conjunctions, and maybe that information was passed on generation after generation, and eventually it was woven into the narrative of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a combination of events, not just that conjunction, but maybe that conjunction as well as a comet that appeared in the sky. Determining the facts is easy. If we know exactly where the planets are now, winding the clock back 2,000 years is easy. We have the precision to be able to tell where Jupiter and Saturn and Venus and all the other planets were in the sky to incredible precision. We know where the comets were, though we don't know how bright they would be. So determining the facts of what was in the sky is easy. Second guessing what significance those observations would have made to astrologers, that, of course, is pure speculation. But regardless, the underlying message is, of course, the same. I hope everybody has a wonderful Christmas this year. Thank you for listening.